The Xanthari Dominion had ruled the stars for longer than most civilizations could remember. Their warships blotted out suns, their laws bent entire galaxies to their will, and now, after a campaign that lasted barely 6 months, Earth had fallen, just like every other world before it. From orbit, the planet looked quiet. No more missile trails, no more defiant radio broadcasts, just silence wrapped in the soft blue glow of oceans and clouds. The Empire called it peace. The humans called it the end. Aboard the Eclipsean Prime, a massive citadel that hung like a black jewel above Earth's atmosphere, celebration was in full swing. Alien nobles in shimmering robes clinked crystal goblets filled with glowing nectar. Holographic banners displayed the Xanthari sigil, a coiled serpent swallowing its own tail, over images of crumbling human cities. At the center of it all stood Vorlak, the High Imperator. Tall, armored in obsidian plates etched with ancient runes, he didn't smile. He didn't need to. His presence alone was victory made flesh. The last spark of resistance is extinguished, he announced, voice echoing through the grand hall. Humanity is now part of the Eternal Order. But not everyone in the room believed it. Near the back, half hidden behind a pillar of polished meteorite stone, stood a man in a simple gray suit. No medals, no armor. Just a human diplomat who'd been allowed to attend the ceremony as a gesture, some might say a joke, of inclusion. He looked tired. His eyes were shadowed, his posture slightly slumped, as if the weight of the last few months had pressed him into the floor. To the Xanthari, he was harmless, a relic, a voice that had once pleaded for peace, then for mercy, and finally for time, and had been ignored each time. They thought he was broken. They were wrong. His name wasn't shouted in war rooms or carved into monuments. Most humans wouldn't have recognized him on the street. But he'd been there from the beginning. From the first alien ship appearing over Geneva, to the final transmission from the last orbital defense platform. While generals planned last stands and scientists scrambled for weapons, he'd done something quieter, something the Empire never understood. He'd read, not just news reports or military briefs, but old treaties, forgotten agreements, dusty records buried in Earth's digital archives and, later, in the Xanthari's own public data vaults. Because even empires keep records, especially empires. They love to document their glory. And in those records he'd found something strange. Something small. A line repeated in ancient texts, in diplomatic footnotes, in the founding charters of councils long dissolved. A line the Xanthari quoted proudly when it suited them, and ignored completely when it didn't. He hadn't mentioned it. Not yet. He watched. He listened. He let them think they'd won. The party raged on around him. Music pulsed, deep, resonant tones that vibrated in the chest rather than the ears. Servants floated trays of exotic fruits that shimmered with bioluminescence. A group of young Xanthari officers laughed loudly, reenacting the fall of Luna Base with hand gestures and exaggerated roars. One of them spotted the human and nudged his friend. "Look, the last diplomat. Still waiting for someone to listen?" They chuckled and moved on, already forgetting him. He didn't react. He just sipped the water they'd given him, plain earth water brought up from the surface in a sealed container. It tasted like rain and soil, like home, and in that moment he made a decision. Not with a shout or a weapon, but with a quiet certainty that settled in his bones like a second heartbeat. The Empire thought this was the end. But he knew better. This wasn't the end. It was the opening move. Back on Earth, in hidden bunkers and underground networks, people were still alive. Not just surviving, organizing. Farmers in the Midwest were sharing food through encrypted mesh networks. Teachers in Mumbai were holding secret classes on history and rights. Engineers in Nairobi were jury-rigging old satellites to send coded messages. They hadn't surrendered. They'd just gone quiet. And they were waiting. For a signal. For hope. For someone who could speak the language of power in a way the Empire couldn't ignore. The diplomat knew he couldn't fight their warships. But maybe, just maybe, he could fight their rules. He slipped away from the celebration unnoticed. No one stopped him. Why would they? He was nobody. Just a man in a wrinkled suit walking down a corridor lined with alien art, twisting sculptures that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. He reached his quarters, a small room with a viewport overlooking Earth. The planet hung there, beautiful and wounded. Cities dark, skies scarred by contrails and ash, but still turning, still breathing. He sat at the desk they'd provided, more of a courtesy than a kindness, and opened his personal data pad. Not the one they'd given him. A hidden one, smuggled in pieces and reassembled over weeks. On it, a single file glowed softly. Galactic Concord. Founding Statutes. Cycle 0. He scrolled to the first page. At the very top, in bold, unadorned script, it read, Law Number 1. No sentient species may be subjugated without its freely given, informed consent under conditions of sovereign parity. He'd read it 100 times. Memorized it. Dreamed about it. The Zenthari had signed this law themselves thousands of years ago, when they were just another rising power begging for a seat at the galactic table. They'd sworn on it, built their legitimacy on it, and now they'd erased it from their textbooks, buried it in archives, pretended it never existed. But laws don't disappear just because you stop talking about them. He leaned back, staring at Earth. Somewhere down there, a child was looking up at the stars, wondering if anyone was still fighting for them. He thought about the promises he'd made, to his colleagues, to the people who'd trusted him, to the future he couldn't see but refused to give up on. The Empire had taken everything, cities, armies, satellites, hope. But they'd missed one thing. They'd forgotten that humans weren't just fighters or builders or dreamers. They were also readers, rememberers, keepers of words, and words, when spoken at the right time in the right place with the right weight behind them, could topple empires. He closed the file, took a deep breath, then stood up, straightened his suit, and walked back toward the heart of the Citadel. Not as a prisoner, not as a guest, but as a petitioner, as a witness, as the only person in the galaxy who still remembered what Law Number 1 really meant. The party was winding down. Vorlak was giving another speech, this time about the dawn of a new era of unity. The diplomat didn't interrupt. He just stood at the edge of the crowd, eyes locked on the Imperator, silent and steady. Let them celebrate, he thought. Let them believe they've won. Because soon, very soon, he would say 3 words that would change everything. You forgot Law Number 1. After the victory gala, life under the Zenthari dominion settled into a strange kind of quiet. Not peace, never peace, but a heavy, watchful stillness like the air before a storm that never comes. Cities stood half empty. Streets once buzzing with traffic now echoed with the measured steps of alien patrols. Humans moved with their heads down, speaking in whispers, eyes darting toward the sky whenever a Zenthari cruiser passed overhead. The Empire called it order. The humans called it waiting. The diplomat wasn't imprisoned. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he was given a small room on the lower levels of the Eclipsion Prime, with a data terminal and limited access to the Imperial archives, a privilege granted to cooperative species representatives. To the Zenthari, it was a harmless gesture. Let the human read old laws. Let him feel useful. He couldn't do anything. Earth had signed the surrender. The war was over, but they didn't understand what reading meant to him. Every morning he woke before the artificial sunrise cycle began on the station. He'd make a cup of rehydrated tea, real earth tea leaves, smuggled in by a dock worker from Jakarta, and sit at his terminal. The Zenthari archives were vast, layered like an onion made of light and memory. Most of it was propaganda, glorious battles, imperial decrees, genealogies of noble bloodlines. But buried beneath the noise in forgotten subfolders and archived tribunal records were the bones of something older. That's where he found it again. Law Number 1, not just mentioned once, but referenced in dozens of old cases. A mining colony on Xylos Prime had used it to reject forced labor contracts. A waterworld species had invoked it to block annexation. Each time, the Zenthari had honored it, back when they needed allies, back when their power wasn't absolute. But as their empire grew, the law faded from public view. Not erased, just tucked away like an embarrassing family secret. He started taking notes. Not on the official terminal, that was watched. Instead, he used a cracked old stylus and a paper notebook, the kind Earth still made in hidden workshops. He wrote slowly, carefully, cross-referencing dates, treaty numbers, witness testimonies. He found a recording from 8,000 cycles ago, grainy, flickering, of a Zenthari elder swearing before the original Concord Council. We bind ourselves to Law Number 1, not out of weakness, but because true strength lies in consent, not conquest. His hands shook when he heard it. He also reached out, not through official channels, those were monitored, but through the quiet networks that always survive, even under occupation. A message hidden in a maintenance drone's diagnostic code, a symbol scratched into a ration crate, a single line of poetry in an old Earth language, sent via a civilian freighter's cargo manifest. The message was always the same. Hold on. There's another way. Down on Earth, people listened. In basements lit by solar lanterns, in tunnels beneath ruined cities, in fishing villages where the Empire hadn't bothered to send patrols, small groups gathered around cracked tablets. They weren't planning attacks. They were studying, learning, remembering that they hadn't truly consented to this. Their leaders had been threatened, their cities bombed, their families held hostage. That wasn't consent. That was coercion. And coercion, according to the very laws the Zenthari claimed to uphold, meant the surrender was invalid. One night, a young woman in Reykjavik, her parents lost in the orbital strikes, decoded a message hidden in a weather satellite signal. It was just 3 words, Law 1 stands. She cried, not from sadness but from relief. Someone was still fighting, not with guns but with truth. Back on the station, the Diplomat kept digging. He found something even more valuable, the Tribunal of Echoes. It wasn't a myth. It was real. A judicial body formed by the oldest species in the galaxy, meant to interpret the original Concord laws when disputes arose. It hadn't convened in over 3,000 cycles. Most believed it was extinct. But the archives showed it had never been dissolved, just dormant, and the rules stated that any sentient being could petition it, as long as they presented a valid legal challenge under the founding statutes. He spent weeks drafting the petition, rewriting it, refining it. Every word had to be perfect. Not emotional, not angry, just clear, precise and rooted in the Empire's own legal tradition. He cited the forced evacuation of coastal cities, the erasure of human cultural records, the detention of civilians without trial, each violation tied back to the core principle, no subjugation without free and informed consent. He knew the risk. If the Zenthari found out what he was doing, they'd delete his access, lock him away, or worse. But he also knew something they didn't. Fear only works if people believe there's no alternative. And now, there was one. One evening, as he walked back from the archive wing, a Zenthari guard, a low-ranking officer with tired eyes, nodded at him. Not a salute, just a nod. The Diplomat nodded back. In that tiny exchange, something passed between them. Not friendship, but recognition. Even among the conquerors, not everyone believed in what was being done. That night, he finalized the petition. He encrypted it inside a harmless-looking cultural exchange file, Earth folk songs, supposedly, and routed it through a chain of civilian data relays, bouncing it across neutral systems until it reached a dead-drop node near the galactic core. From there, it would find its way to the last known contact point of the Tribunal of Echoes. He didn't know if anyone would receive it, didn't know if the tribunal still existed, but he had to try. The next morning, he returned to his usual routine, tea, terminal, quiet observation. The Zenthari saw a broken man going through the motions, but inside he felt something he hadn't in months. Hope, not loud or flashy, just steady, like a pilot light in a dark house. Because he knew the truth now, the Empire hadn't won. They'd just forgotten their own rules. And in that forgetting, they'd left a door open. All he had to do was walk through it, and remind the galaxy that even the mightiest empires are bound by the words they once swore to uphold. He looked out his viewport again. Earth spun below, silent but not dead. Somewhere down there, someone was humming one of those folk songs he'd sent. Somewhere, a child was learning about Law No. 1 in a hidden classroom. And somewhere in the deep void between stars, a message was traveling, carrying not a weapon, but a question. Do your own laws still mean anything to you? The answer would change everything. Weeks passed. Life on the station settled into its uneasy rhythm. The Diplomat kept his head down, sipping his tea, scrolling through approved archives, saying little. The Zenthari barely noticed him anymore. To them, he was furniture, part of the background like the hum of the air recyclers or the soft glow of the corridor lights. They had no idea that the quiet man in the gray suit had already set something in motion that could unravel their entire empire. Then, without warning, the stars themselves seemed to shift. It started with a signal, not a broadcast. Not a threat, but a single pulse of light from the galactic core, so ancient and precise it bypassed every firewall, every filter, every layer of Zenthari control. It wasn't meant for ships or stations. It was meant for memory, and it carried a message only the oldest civilizations would recognize. The Tribunal of Echoes is reconvening. At first, no one believed it. The Zenthari command dismissed it as a glitch, a cosmic echo, a trick of deep space static. But then the witnesses began to appear. Not in ships, not with weapons. They simply arrived. In the void near the Eclipsion Prime, space rippled like water. From that ripple stepped beings made of light and silence. Tall, shimmering figures wrapped in robes woven from starlight and time. Their faces were indistinct, shifting like smoke, but their presence carried weight. Not physical weight, but the kind that bends reality. One moment the station's sensors showed empty space. The next they registered impossible energy signatures, calm, ancient, and utterly indifferent to the Dominion's authority. The Zenthari panicked. Alarms blared. Warships powered up, but Vorlak himself ordered them to stand down. He recognized the sigil glowing above the newcomers, a spiral of 7 rings, the mark of the original conquered. This wasn't an invasion. It was a summons. The tribunal had heard the petition. Within hours, the Grand Chamber of the Eclipsion Prime, once used for victory speeches and imperial decrees, was transformed. The Zenthari banners were taken down. In their place hung neutral banners of woven cosmic dust, glowing faintly with the light of dead stars. The air grew still, charged with something older than law, older than war. Even the station's artificial gravity seemed to soften, as if bowing in respect. The Diplomat was summoned. Not dragged. Not escorted like a prisoner. He was invited. 2 of the luminous beings met him at his door. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He simply followed them, heart pounding but step steady. Inside the chamber, Vorlak stood at the center, armored as always, flanked by his highest commanders. He looked furious but also uneasy. This wasn't his stage anymore. The tribunal sat in a half-circle of floating thrones, their forms flickering like candle flames in a breeze. Between them hovered a sphere of pure data, the petition now open for all to see. One of the tribunal members turned toward the Diplomat. A voice filled the room, not through sound but directly in the mind, calm, genderless, echoing with the patience of millennia. "You have invoked Law Number 1. Present your case." He didn't shout, didn't gesture dramatically. He just spoke clearly and slowly, like a teacher explaining something simple to a child who'd forgotten. He described how Earth's leaders had been given an ultimatum: surrender or watch every major city burn. He played recordings, smuggled out by brave civilians, of Zenthari officers threatening families, blocking food shipments, erasing cultural archives. He showed how human representatives had been denied legal counsel, how the so-called surrender treaty was signed under duress, with no chance to consult their people. Then he did something unexpected. He quoted the Zenthari themselves. He pulled up a recording from their own history, their ancestors standing before the Concord Council, swearing, "We will never impose our will on another people without their free and informed consent." He showed treaty after treaty where the Zenthari had used Law Number 1 to protect their own interests, to block rivals, to claim moral high ground. And yet, he said, voice quiet but firm, when it came to Earth, that law vanished. Not because it was repealed, not because it no longer applied, but because you thought no one would remember. A murmur rippled through the chamber, not from the tribunal but from the Zenthari officers. Some looked down, others exchanged glances. Even among conquerors, shame has a way of finding its mark. Vorlak stepped forward, fists clenched. "This is a farce," he boomed. Humanity was chaotic, divided, weak. They brought destruction upon themselves. Order must be imposed on those who cannot govern themselves. The tribunal didn't react with anger. They simply observed. One of them floated closer to Vorlak. "Order without consent is not order," the voice said gently. "It is control. And control, no matter how efficient, is not justice." Then they turned to the Diplomat. "Do you seek vengeance?" He shook his head. "No, I seek recognition, that we are people, that our voice matters, that your own laws, your own promises still mean something, At that moment, something shifted across the galaxy. On a dozen vassal worlds, species long silenced by the Dominion, people watched the live feed, leaked by sympathetic techs. A desert planet where water was rationed by Zenthari decree. An ocean world whose songs had been banned. A forest moon whose elders had been exiled. They saw a human, small and unarmed, standing before the most powerful empire in existence, and winning not with force but with truth. Rebellion didn't erupt with explosions. It began with whispers, with data packets sent in the night, with workers slowing production, with students asking questions their teachers couldn't answer. The myth of Zenthari invincibility cracked, not with a bang, but with a sigh of collective realization: they can be challenged. Back in the chamber, the tribunal announced their decision would come after 3 cycles of review. But everyone knew the outcome was already written. The law was clear. The evidence was undeniable. As the diplomat walked back to his quarters, he passed a group of young Zenthari cadets. They didn't laugh this time. One of them met his eyes and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He returned to his room, poured a cup of tea and looked out at Earth. Down there, someone was probably watching the stars, wondering if tonight was the night everything changed. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Earth wouldn't be remembered as the world that fell, but as the world that reminded the galaxy what law really means. The day of the final hearing arrived not with fanfare, but with a deep, quiet tension that settled over the entire station like morning fog. Even the usual hum of machinery seemed muted, as if the Ecliptian Prime itself was holding its breath. Outside the grand chamber, Zenthari soldiers stood rigid, their armor polished to a mirror shine, but their eyes kept flicking toward the doors. Inside, the air felt thick, not with heat but with history. Vorlak entered last. He wore his full ceremonial armor, the kind reserved for coronations and declarations of war. His stride was heavy, deliberate, each step echoing like a drumbeat. He didn't look at the diplomat. He didn't need to. In his mind, this was still his domain, his moment to reclaim control. He would speak and the tribunal, old, slow, out of touch, would see reason. They would understand that the galaxy needed strength, not sentiment. He took the center of the chamber and began to speak. His voice rolled like thunder, filling every corner, every shadow. He spoke of chaos before the Dominion, of wars between species, of planets burning while others turned away. He painted the Zenthari not as conquerors, but as guardians, bringers of peace through power. Without us, he declared, the galaxy would tear itself apart. Humanity was no different. Divided, weak, unready, we gave them order. We saved them from themselves. He paused, letting the words hang. Then he turned slightly, just enough to gesture toward the human standing quietly near the edge of the room. And now this. Petitioner dares to question our mercy, our wisdom. He clings to a law written in dust, spoken by ghosts while real beings suffer in real time. Law No. 1 is a relic, a child's dream. The universe does not run on dreams. It runs on strength. A few Zenthari officers nodded, some even straightened with pride. For a moment it almost worked. The old story, the story of might making right, felt familiar, comfortable, safe. Then the diplomat stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point or glare. He simply walked to the center of the chamber, stood a few paces from Vorlak and looked not at the Imperator but at the tribunal. His suit was wrinkled, his shoes scuffed. He looked like someone who'd been up all night worrying about rent, not someone facing down an empire. And then he said it. You forgot Law No. 1. 3 words. Simple. Clear. No flourish. No anger, just truth spoken plainly. The room didn't erupt. It froze. Even Vorlak blinked as if the words had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Because in that moment, everyone in the chamber remembered, not just the law itself, but what it represented. The promise that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the basic dignity of others. That consent isn't optional. That might doesn't make right. The diplomat didn't stop there. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for a small data chip. He inserted it into the chamber's central console. Instantly, the air filled with light, not harsh or blinding, but soft, like dawn. A recording began to play. It was old, grainy. The image flickered, but the voice was clear. It was a Zenthari elder centuries ago, standing before the original Concord Council. His robes were simpler, his face lined with humility, not pride, and he was saying, "We swear by the stars and the silence between them. We will never subjugate another people without their free and informed consent. For to do so is to betray not only them, but ourselves." The recording ended. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. Heavy with memory, with shame. One of the tribunal members rose. Their forms shimmered like heat over desert sand. They didn't look at Vorlak. They looked at the Zenthari officers lining the walls, at the young ones, the ones who'd grown up believing their empire was flawless. "You taught your children that Law Mir 1 was obsolete," the voice said, gentle but firm. "But laws do not expire because you stop teaching them, they wait. And when forgotten, they return, not as punishment, but as reminder." Then came the ruling. The annexation of Earth was declared null and void. Not because humanity was special, not because the Zenthari were evil, but because the process itself violated the very foundation of galactic law they claimed to uphold. And worse, by knowingly breaking Law Number 1, the Dominion had breached its own covenant with the Concord. Their sovereign status was suspended. Their authority over vassal worlds was now open to legal challenge. Vorlak staggered back as if struck. Not by force, but by the weight of his own hypocrisy. His empire hadn't been defeated by weapons. It had unraveled because it stopped believing in its own words. News spread faster than any warship could fly. On a mining moon where workers had toiled for generations under Zenthari overseers, shift leaders quietly powered down the drills. "We're not going back," one said, and no one argued. On a water-rich planet whose rivers had been diverted to feed Zenthari cities, local councils reassembled for the first time in decades. In orbital shipyards, engineers refused to repair Dominion cruisers. "We build for peace now," they told their commanders. Back on Earth, people gathered in the streets, not to riot, but to listen, to watch, to hope. In a village in the Andes, an old woman turned on a salvaged radio. Through static, she heard a voice, calm, human, reporting the tribunal's decision. She began to cry. Not from sadness, but because for the first time in months she felt like her world mattered again. The diplomat didn't celebrate. He stood in his room watching Earth turn below. He knew this wasn't the end. There would be resistance. There would be confusion. Some Zenthari loyalists would fight. Some worlds wouldn't know how to govern themselves after centuries of control. But that wasn't his job anymore. His job had been to remind them that the rules still existed, that even the smallest voice could echo if it spoke the truth at the right time. Later that night, a message reached him, not through official channels, but through a hidden frequency used by Earth's underground networks. It was just a single line typed in plain text. "Thank you for remembering what we couldn't." He smiled. Then he poured a cup of tea, sat by the viewport, and watched the stars, not as a prisoner, not as a diplomat, but as a human being who had just helped the galaxy remember its own soul. And somewhere, in 1,000 hidden places across the stars, others were doing the same, whispering those 3 words like a prayer, like a promise. You forgot Law 1. Years passed. The galaxy didn't heal overnight, but it began to breathe again. The Zenthari Dominion didn't vanish. It couldn't, not after ruling for so long, but it changed. Without the legal cover of absolute authority, its grip loosened. Worlds once forced into silence now sent representatives to a newly revived galactic concord. Old treaties were dusted off, rewritten with fairness in mind. And at the heart of it all was a simple idea. No one gets to decide for someone else unless they agree to it. Earth wasn't handed back like a lost toy. It was returned with respect. Human engineers worked alongside former Zenthari architects to rebuild cities, not as monuments to conquest, but as homes. Schools reopened, not just teaching math and science, but history, real history with all its mistakes and triumphs. Children learned about Law Number 1 not as a dusty rule, but as a living promise, that dignity belongs to everyone no matter how small they seem. The diplomat never became a leader in the way people expected. He didn't run for office. He didn't give grand speeches from balconies. Instead, he quietly helped set up the new Concord's legal library, making sure every species, big or small, loud or quiet, could access the same laws, the same rights. He believed that true peace wasn't built on treaties signed in fear, but on understanding shared in daylight. One spring morning, he stood on a hill outside what used to be Geneva. The city below was still patching itself together. Cranes dotted the skyline, gardens grew where rubble once lay, but the air smelled like blossoms and fresh rain. A peace summit was being held nearby, the first where humans sat as equals, not petitioners. Delegates from dozens of worlds milled about, some in robes, some in uniforms, some in forms so strange they barely looked solid. Yet they all spoke the same language now, the language of mutual respect. As he watched, a young Xanthari approached. Not a soldier, not an officer, just a student sent by their world to learn. Their eyes were wide, curious, a little nervous. They stopped a few feet away, then bowed slightly. Not the stiff bow of protocol, but the kind you give someone you genuinely admire. "You're the one," they said softly. The one who said the 3 words. The diplomat nodded. "I did." The student hesitated, then asked, "Was it really just one law that changed everything?" He smiled. Not a proud smile. A tired, kind one. "It wasn't the law alone," he said. "It was that someone remembered it, and that someone else was willing to listen." He looked out over the valley. In the distance, children, human and alien, were playing near a rebuilt fountain. They didn't care about old wars or ancient empires. They were chasing bubbles, laughing in a mix of languages that somehow still understood each other. That, he thought, was the real victory. Later that day during the summit, he didn't speak much. He let others share their stories. The fisher folk from an ocean moon who'd reclaimed their tides, the desert farmers who'd won back their water rights, the artists whose songs were no longer banned. Each story was different, but they all circled back to the same truth. When people are treated like people, not problems to be managed, they rise. The Xanthari Imperator was gone now. Vorlak had stepped down, not in chains but in quiet shame. In his place stood a council of elders and reformers, many of whom had once whispered doubts in the dark. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They asked how to do better. And that, the diplomat believed, was the first real step. Back in his small office, just a room with a desk, a window, and shelves full of books, he kept a single item on the wall, a framed copy of Law No. 1 printed in simple letters on plain paper. No gold leaf, no fancy script, just the words, "No sentient species may be subjugated without its freely given, informed consent under conditions of sovereign parity." He didn't need it for reference. He knew it by heart. He kept it there as a reminder, not just for others, but for himself. Power doesn't come from weapons or fleets or fear. It comes from holding on to what's right even when no one's watching. Sometimes, late at night, he'd receive messages. Not official ones, personal ones. A teacher in Nairobi thanking him for helping restore their history curriculum. A mechanic on a distant station saying their kid now wants to study law instead of joining the military. A former Xanthari clerk who'd started a community garden on their homeworld writing, "I finally understand what consent really means." He never replied with grand words. Just a simple "you're welcome" or "keep going," because the work wasn't his alone anymore. It belonged to everyone, and that was the most beautiful part. The galaxy hadn't been saved by a hero. It had been healed by ordinary people choosing every day to treat each other with fairness. To listen, to remember, to say when something felt wrong, "Wait, that's not how it's supposed to be." As the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, the diplomat walked back toward the summit hall. He passed a group of children again. One of them, a human girl with braided hair, held a small device, showing an alien friend how to play an old Earth game. The alien laughed, tapped the screen, and said something in their own language. The girl didn't understand the words, but she understood the joy. She grinned and handed over the device. He watched them for a moment, then kept walking. No one cheered as he entered the hall. No one stood up. But when he sat down, a few delegates nodded. Not out of duty, out of respect, because they knew. The quiet man in the simple suit hadn't just changed the law. He'd reminded the galaxy that the oldest laws, the ones about fairness, dignity, and choice, are also the strongest shields. And sometimes all it takes to rebuild a broken world is one person brave enough to say, gently but firmly, "You forgot Law No. 1.